This week we're exploring the concept of complexity and how it relates to ecosystem restoration. And so in particular we want to focus on defining what complexity is, how we measure it, and how it relates to ecosystem restoration. So our goal after this week's material is that you will develop a better understanding of the importance of complexity and those interactions between ecosystem components that really comprise what we mean when we say complexity. And so if you recall from our previous lectures where we discussed what restoration is and how restoration really is the acid test of our understanding of how an ecosystem works and the processes and interactions that underlie the ecosystem developmental process, this is going to be critical information to recreate and restore the structure and function of ecosystems. So when we think about complexity, it might be good to start and actually define what complexity is. And so we can think of complexity as an interconnected network of components that cannot be described by only a few rules. And generally, these interconnected network of components generally manifest themselves in the structure, order, and functioning that emerges from these interactions among the diverse parts or components that make up the network or the ecosystem. And so we can look at an example here from the Southern Appalachians where we look at a hemlock ravine ecosystem where we have a variety of different types of structures that are in place. We have horizontal and longitudinal structure in terms of the stream components, the rocks, the pools, the riffles that form as part of this headwater stream and ravine environment. And then as we look across the riparian ecotone, or that area from the stream outwards, we find in this picture a variety of different size classes of hemlock, some beech, and birch in these ecosystems as well. And then a different vertical structure as well, where we have this dense rhododendron understory that you see here growing in the bottom that changes the environment in terms of shading that reaches the forest floor. You can see some sunflecks in areas of the forest floor that actually are receiving some direct sunlight, but others that are in deep shade underneath this hemlock canopy and then the rhododendron subcanopy. So all of these different aspects, these structures that we can see here in this slide, and the processes and dynamics are all interrelated in this complex ecosystem that we need to understand those interrelationships and how those interrelationships emerge in terms of the structure and function of the ecosystem that we're trying to restore. And so we can look at a figure here that gives you an idea of how we can conceptually view an ecosystem as a complex system. And so our ecosystem is in this grayish area here that operates, and these interactions are at various different scales that you see here in the figure. And we also see that there's lots of internal components to the ecosystem that are interacting with each other. We may have plants that are interacting with the soil that also interacts with the plants. We have precipitation that falls, helps the plant grow, which then may form an interaction with insects that then feed on the plants. And then we have light that influences the plant life. And all of that then feeds back through these various scales and various feedbacks and various interactions with the soil. And so within this ecosystem, as far as a complex system, we have a lot of internal components that are constantly interacting with each other. And then there are external factors that are interacting that we need to be cognizant of as to how those actually are changing these interactions that occur within the ecosystem as well. So we may have things such as disturbances, fires that we talked about with ponderosa pine ecosystems this week in our reading, and last week as well when we looked at longleaf pine. We may have other external factors, things like land use, land change, and climate change that are going to influence how these various components interact with each other. And based on those, there are going to be these emergent properties, things that really do reflect things such as this complexity, these emergent components and emergent properties that are going to regulate how adaptable and how organized these systems are, that may then result back either in a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop with the ecosystem itself. All right, and some of these adaptability and self-organization factors, may be things such as human land use and other external factors that are going to perhaps limit the resilience or the ability for one of these ecosystems to try to recover from some sort of disturbance or some sort of ecosystem factor. So really the point here is to really think about these ecosystems that we're trying to restore as being really complex in terms of their interactions, and it's those internal and external interactions and the properties that emerge from these interactions that are really going to drive how well we can restore those ecosystems. And so this really begs then the question why this is really important for restoration, and why should we be really focused here on understanding a little bit about complexity as we move forward. And so I guess one important point to make here is that when we think about complexity and the terms that we often use to describe complexity, we may be using these to implicitly indicate or implicitly use these terms to describe complexity as an indicator of how natural the system is, or an indicator of naturalness you'll often see in the scientific literature. And so how this relates back to restoration is that this idea of naturalness, and we talked about this topic earlier in the semester in a very nice lecture that Matt provided, as something that we often strive for when we are thinking about ecosystem restoration. We want to restore the ecosystem structure and function so that it more closely resembles that natural system. And it is that complexity, those interactions of ecosystem components, both internally to the ecosystem as well as externally, that are going to help create that complexity, and that understanding that is going to be critical for us to understand that naturalness of the ecosystem, which is going to be something that we strive as part of that reference condition, or those reference conditions that we're trying to restore to, and using as a yardstick for how well our restoration practice has been in terms of successfully meeting those goals. So there are a variety of terms that we use when we think about complexity, and you'll run into these over your career and through the readings as far as how we describe the complexity of an ecosystem. And I think it's really important that we have some idea of what these mean in the context of complexity and complexity science. And so there are a variety of terms, but there are three terms that I really want to highlight here that you'll often see that are used to describe that the varied ways ecosystems at a variety of scales are non-homogeneous or heterogeneous, right? In other words, there are a variety of terms that often are used in ways to help describe this idea of complexity. And so one of those is a term that we used and covered last week when we talked about diversity and biodiversity. And so a term that we'll often use when we think about complexity is diverse. All right, and so we would use this term as that we have a diverse ecosystem in the contribution to complexity is because it is a diverse ecosystem. And we can use this when we're describing elements of the ecosystem that are going to be categorical. Right? So we may have species, individual species, or functional traits of species that we kind of have this diverse group of species or things that really drive the complexity. And this is not only species or functional traits, but it could also be the ecosystem types or the genetic diversity. And if we have a lot of genetic diversity, then that may contribute to the complexity of the ecosystem. And it's one way we can think about how we describe complexity and how we start to think about quantifying complexity, which is going to be important when we think about how we're going to use this concept in a restoration perspective. Two other terms that really focus on describing elements that we would consider those to be continuous rather than categorical, things such as tree size and gap size and number of snags per hectare and things like this. These are continuous variables that we may describe as being used to describe the complexity of an ecosystem that is going to be heterogeneous, or is it variable? And so these are going to be terms rather than diverse that we would use with categorical variable. Variable and heterogeneous might be terms that we use to describe elements that are going to be continuous data. Right? And heterogeneity is one that we often think about when we're considering the spatial arrangement of components in the ecosystem. So how heterogeneous is our live and dead fuels in a fire-prone ecosystem? Is there a lot of spatial heterogeneity out there that would suggest that we have some underlying patterns that we would want to emulate as part of our restoration plan, or is it more is there low heterogeneity, which would suggest that those components are arranged spatially in a rather uniform way? Variable is a term that we would think about both spatial and temporal phenomena, such as stand structural is variable over time. So in that case, the diameter distribution of ponderosa pine in the Mount Trumbull ecosystem may change over time, and there we may say that, well, that stand structure is highly variable, both in terms of its spatial distribution as well as its temporal distribution as those forests develop over time and are influenced by low severity surface fires that may have been more common on the pre-Euro-American landscape. The distribution may be more highly variable than one that, say, is in an area where fire has been excluded. So again, that gives you an idea of how these terms, variable and heterogeneity, may be used in terms of helping to describe complexity. And so just another example to kind of demonstrate that graphically here. So this is some data from a really nice paper in 2014 by D.L. Fry and others, looking at the distribution of mixed conifer and Jeffrey pine systems across California and then down into Baja California and Mexico. And again, this is just to drive home the point that we're looking at spatial patterns. And if we look at these black dots across these four different old growth areas that these researchers studied, looking at the spatial patterns in active fire and fire suppressed old growth mixed conifer forests, you can really see that there is a spatial patterning to how we would look at those patterns in terms of these different species, such as Jeffrey pine, Pinus contorta, and Pinus lambertina, and Abies concolor. You look at these and you look at how they're distributed in space, and you'd see that the distribution might be variable in space in terms of Jeffrey pine, and it's variable in space, or there's significant or high spatial heterogeneity in the distribution of Jeffrey pine across these 4 different areas. We could also then look at, basically look to see in terms of complexity, the diversity or how diverse are these different stands, and there's variability spatially across these broad landscapes and physiographic ranges from the far south on Baja California. There's a much different spatial distribution of species versus those up in the Sierra Nevada up near Lake Tahoe. So again, we can think about this across a variety of scales, regionally, but then also looking at, say, how Jeffrey pine differs within these units. And you look down into Baja California, and we can start to think about the high spatial variability associated with Jeffrey pine in these systems, where we have broad areas where they may be more uniformly or look to be uniformly dispersed, but then lots of high and patches of high density Jeffrey pine that we don't see up here at the Lost Cannon or Tea Kettle sites that are going to be in the Sierra Nevada. So again, just throwing this in there to give you an idea of kind of what we're talking about when we think about complexity in terms of its heterogeneity, its variability, and diverse, in terms of how those terms can be used associated with the concept of complexity when we think about ecosystem structure and function. So a little more about these terms, so while diverse and variable and heterogeneity are all going to be used to emphasize the variety of range of elements or components in the system, such as snags or trees or environments or soil texture. I mean, we could look at a variety of these different elements. If you go back to that slide that I showed that kind of describes a complex system, when we take those ideas and kind of that variety of a range of elements that we're describing in those ecosystems, we can also then think about the terms of complex or complexity to really describe the interactions among the elements. And this is kind of the point that I really want to drive home with this short lecture, is that we have ways to describe the variety of range of elements, but it's when we think about complexity, or if we try to describe how complex the system is, we really want to get at those interactions. Okay, and there's some assumptions that we would bring to the table here when we think about complexity. And one is that there's going to be some hidden order that lies between the visible order and the randomness associated with the distribution, the range of elements and components in the systems, right? And so what this really requires is that we have a good understanding of the components, their distribution in both space and time, and then how they interact with each other. Okay. I'd also add here that it's really important to point out that complex is not necessarily the same as being complicated. And so in a complex system, complexity is really going to describe those surprising or emergent phenomena that arise due to those interactions among the parts of the system. All right, and so complexity can really be thought of as kind of that hidden order that lies between the visible order and randomness, or we could think of that as the amount of information that we need to fully describe or recreate the system. Again, getting back to our earlier lecture about Tony Bradshaw and that acid test of restoration. Do we have enough information about the components and how they interact to fully recreate that ecosystem as part of our restoration process? Right? And so to describe the quantify the complexity of a system such as a ponderosa pine ecosystem, like we read in the paper this week, really requires that you have a solid understanding of the interactions of the different ecosystem components and structures as they relate to both those negative and positive feedbacks. You also need to understand the flow of energy among the elements and the redundancy or overlap within the system, right? Which then allows for multiple avenues to maintain those important ecosystem functions, as well as complement the complementary functional traits that these species may have. Okay, and so complicated systems, on the other hand, are going to be those that have many interacting components that are very hard to understand. But those interactions really follow some sort of linear logic change, and there's behavior in the system that can be predicted without or with some precision. Right? And so you could think of a computer as being quite complicated, because most of us wouldn't be able to take the computer apart and reconstruct it because it's complicated. We don't understand how all that works. All right. But the reaction of that system to those outside influences, I mean, I hit my keyboard here and something's going to happen with how that computer operates, is going to be highly predictable with consistent and repeatable results. All right. So that really describes a complicated system. It's one that's difficult to understand. But when we think about complexity, it means that we have a lot of interactions. Okay, it's those properties, phenomena that arise due to the interactions of the parts of the system. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about complexity, complexity just doesn't mean, oh, it's really complicated, it's hard to figure out, and I can't figure it out because it is too complex. Really what we're talking about there is those interactions. And that's what you really want to understand. That's why we're spending so much time on this week thinking about that, and how structures are one of the important ways that we measure that, as they did in the Mount Trumbull example from the readings this week, in a way that are going to provide you with an avenue or a mechanism to really capture or understand that complexity, understand those interactions, so that you can use that information to help recreate the system. All right. As I mentioned earlier, there is this relationship back to understanding naturalness, right? This idea that if we understand how inherently the system works, that should give us an idea of how variable, how heterogeneous the system is, and that should give us an idea of perhaps an idea of naturalness, which we could think of as being an important part of a restoration plan and ecosystem restoration in general. But I think it's important to point out that this concept of naturalness and how it relates to complexity doesn't necessarily mean we're always going to have a diverse and heterogeneous ecosystem. Okay, and I think we only have to look to the north, to the boreal forests, to really get an idea of this concept or this paradox, if you will, is that doesn't necessarily mean we're always going to have a diverse and high heterogeneity in terms of interactions if we have a truly natural system. And so if we look at these natural boreal forests, these are ecosystems that are going to have very few overstory species, right? There's not many tree species in high tree diversity that we're going to find in these systems, right? A variety of spruce, aspen, birch, maybe a variety, but not anything near what we would find, say, in a longleaf pine ecosystem or even a central hardwood forest ecosystem like we have here in Ohio. So they're going to have a very limited number of tree species. Tree regeneration, we know in a natural environment, is really going to be limited and driven by large-scale disturbances that can lead to dense cover of a single species. Those single species are oftentimes going to be even-aged, and they're going to be even-sized. So in terms of its spatial and temporal development, they're going to be pretty homogeneous, right? There are going to be trees of the same size. They're going to be distributed in the same way, often in a rather uniform pattern, because they really, and they're going to be very dense covered, because they're going to be following after this stand replacing fire where we're. So these are going to be concepts that you really want to focus in on, and give you an idea of, all right, where am I? What is the context in which I'm developing this restoration plan? And that's going to help me drive and figure out things related to complexity and how I can relate that to naturalists and how to restore ecosystems. So, as I mentioned, one of the things that you're going to be interested in doing and thinking about when you develop a restoration plan is how do you go about measuring complexity, right? And I think it's important to point out that there is no basic index of complexity that's generally accepted that you can use to say, oh, I have high complexity, I have low complexity, right? And so there's also no complexity meter that we can take out into to the site or the landscape in which we're trying to restore and determine what the complexity is and boil that down to one number. Really what you need to do is look to measures that try and capture a couple of different things. The first is you want to have measures that really capture ecosystem dynamics or some aspect of ecosystem dynamics. Things such as, do you understand nutrient cycling? Do you understand how the ecosystem is going to respond from a successional perspective to natural disturbances, whether they be fire or wind or flooding, or how they're responding to human caused disturbances, things such as land use, land change. Right? So you'll want to try to capture something about those ecosystem dynamics. The other thing that you're going to want to definitely have is information on the structure and configuration of the ecosystem components. This is where understanding how the overstory trees and the understory and the regeneration layer, what species compose that. That would be this third point, the diversity of ecosystem components. But then how those components are distributed in both space and time are really going to be important as a way for you to develop a picture of what complexity should look like in these ecosystems that you're trying to restore. Right? And our assumption is that a highly complex system will display high complexity in its spatial and temporal dynamics. Right? And we can look to a variety of different components, much the same way that the scientists and researchers in the paper that we had you read this week from the Ponderosa Pine Ecosystems at Mount Trumbull really think about understanding that structure and configuration of the ecosystem components and how that changes using that adaptive management technique, where they applied a variety of different restoration techniques and then studied how and monitored how those changes progressed over time, really helped them get an idea of what they believed the inherent complexity to be in that 1870 landscape, and then how that changed over time with these treatments by comparing those areas they treated with the control landscape. So these can be aspects that are going to be really important for you to think about to try to capture and find information on how the ecosystems develop over time, its successional dynamics, the stand dynamics, how they interact, what are the primary disturbances, how that relates to regulating the structure, both in space and time, of different ecosystem components, both above ground and below ground. And then the diversity of those ecosystem components are going to give you a snapshot or a picture of what the complexity should look like in that reference condition. And then you can measure the same types of components and interactions in your disturbed site, and you can start to follow that through as you start to implement different restoration treatments. So to wrap things up, what does this all mean for restoration? Well, I think we've really only scratched the surface of this whole idea of complexity science and its application to ecosystem restoration. And it's definitely something that I think you can spend more time about, and as you progress in your career as a restoration scientist, will definitely want to spend some more time on. And our hope here is to give you kind of a quick and dirty view of complexity and what this means from restoration and why you should be concerned about it. And when you hear terms such as heterogeneity and complexity and diverse systems and and the like, and how variable things are in space and time, that these are going to be things that you can relate to and say, aha, I know exactly what you're talking about, and then I can go to the literature and to the science and find more information about it. And so I think it's important, again, to remember that to effectively restore the structure and function of an ecosystem, you really do need to understand those processes that are driving ecosystem development, right? And viewing ecosystems as complex and adaptive systems is a really nice mechanism to do that, because we're focused on what? We're focused on those interactions, those processes that are really driving ecosystem development. And if you really understand that, right, Bradshaw would say we could quickly, well, not necessarily quickly, but we could adequately start to reconstruct that if we understand those interactions in that ecosystem development process, and we can put that stand or that landscape back onto a trajectory of development that is going to restore structure and function, which is really important when we think about ecosystem restoration. And so this really includes understanding the spatial and temporal complexity associated with interactions among ecosystem components. So we need to understand what's happening within the ecosystem and how those are all interacting, but we also need to understand the outside forces, such as disturbances, and what happens when we remove certain things from these ecosystems. And that's why we've added that information in video about how wolves in Yellowstone and the restoration of wolves and that keystone predator back into that landscape has actually filtered all the way down and changed the way stream channels are developing in both space and time. And you may be thinking, if you haven't watched that yet, how in the heck could that actually happen? But I think what you'll find is that there are all of these really intricate pathways that are part of these species interactions and ecosystem component interactions that we may not necessarily always understand. But if we remove some of those, we can change all those underlying dynamics, and the consequences for ecosystem structure and function can be pretty dramatic. And when we restore through some understanding of those interactions, we can really have a successful restoration project where we have restored ecosystem structure and function, which is our ultimate aim and goal of a restoration project.